Well, good morning. Welcome to Jags AM on Tuesday, March the 5th, 2024, which means that we are 6 days away from the start of the legal tampering period, whatever that is intended to mean, and then just 8 days from the start of the new league year. Lots of questions to address, plenty to look back on from the Combine last week, and obviously plenty to talk about coming up with some big issues, including, as we introduce John Oehser, senior writer at Jaguars.com, recently returned from Indianapolis, including, John, the decision today on whether or not to franchise Josh Allen, the Jaguars' all-time single-season sack leader with 17.5. Today is the day that the Jaguars either have to apply the tag or work like hell to get a deal done before next week.
Yeah, and the key is if you apply the tag, you can't take it off and re-tag.
Right.
So you can only do it for one guy a year. So the urgency, which is different than last year, remember they tagged Evan Ingram and sort of let it ride.
Right.
The urgency is, you would think they may like to use it on Calvin Ridley. I don't know that for a fact, but that would seem like a possibility.
Well, there's been a lot of chatter about Ridley now all of a sudden, with Mike Evans off the market and other receivers appearing to be done, in T. Higgins going into a franchise situation.
Yeah, so you don't really have it's not as easy to let it ride with Josh as it was with Evan last year. I don't have a real feel for it. I've said over and over and over again, to me it makes sense to sign Josh to a long-term deal. I think he is a guy who, even when he's not performing high sacks numbers, he's always good against the run, always a good locker room guy. I think he's a safe signing. But me saying he's a safe signing doesn't necessarily mean numbers match, because when numbers get into the range that these numbers are going to be, a little difference can be a lot.
And we're going to talk specifically about some of the numbers and what they might mean in terms of the top 5 salary cap hits for edge rushers and wide receivers coming up a little bit later in the show. But let's go with big things. We're going to have an A-block big things, and then we're going to have a B-block big things today. We'll start with big things from Trent Baalke, and we'll talk about what got done last week, which was the first step in the process of a new year.
Again, it goes back to, did the player turn out to be a good football player or didn't he? You're never going to get criticized for taking a good player. If it doesn't work and the player doesn't end up reaching his level of competency or the expectation of the pick, then it's a bad pick. So it just comes down to whether you made the right decision or not.
And those decisions are being made now after a week of evaluations at the Combine, personal interviews, and medical testing. The Jaguars are further in the process, John, of putting their board together and figuring out who are the good players. And I think it's important to point out here, and everything is focused on mock drafts and the first round. But this team needs to hit good players in every round. So this is a long, deep process that they've started.
Yeah, and I laughed when Trent said that, because my thought is the Jaguars fans would criticize him for hitting a good pick.
Well,
they criticized him for Trayvon Walker. Trayvon Walker
turned out to be a really good
player.
That
was a great pick. But I'm obviously kidding about that. They need, I always hesitate to say they need impact in the draft after round one, because history tells me that's difficult to think that you're going to get, at some positions hard to do. At 17, it sure feels like as time goes on, I start leaning. I'm leaning right now, Brian.
Right.
I start leaning more toward this corner position over here. Corners start to make a lot of sense. I'm having trouble now thinking they're going to go a different way, but I may feel different tomorrow. But so much is going to depend on, I think, what they do in free agency, more who they let go than who they don't. I think it's conceivable you could see some wait-and-see guys, meaning guys they retain, and see what happens in the draft and free agency. So we'll see. It's a complicated thing because they're now mature with the salary cap, meaning it's not just add-on.
Right.
It's managing.
Well, see, and that's why you've got to make sure that you find players. Impact's too strong of a word for a guy that you may find in the 4th round. But we're talking this year about, tight end Brenton Strange and running back Tanks Bigsby. These are guys that need to make that next step. When you've got a quarterback who's going to eat up 12, 13, 14% of your cap, and a pass rusher who's going to take a sizable bite, maybe a wide receiver as well, you got to put these jars on the shelf.
Oh, you got to have guys who are good for the long term.
Right.
I'm saying maybe first year.
Draft and develop.
But over time, your first contract players need to be making up now. If you're a mature cap with a elite quarterback, those first contract players have to be all but 5 or 6 year guys.
All right, on to big thing two next week, which is obviously the start of the new league year and free agency, and the aforementioned decisions on both Josh Allen and Calvin Ridley. And it was one of the first questions that the general manager was asked last week in Indianapolis.
There's a lot of players that have hit free agency. There's another bunch of young guys that we're working on potential extensions for. So we've got a lot of balls in the air right now, and we're just going to try to play them one by one.
Listen, everything they need to do with free agency, and there are a number of players, will be predicated on what they get done with Josh and with Calvin.
Yeah, I would be surprised. I would be surprised if they don't sign at least one free agent who people are, that's their guy this year, that kind of level guy. And I think that's why that makes the Ridley decision a little trickier, meaning everybody's talking about, well, if you let Calvin walk, he'll get you a third-round comp next year. Well, not if you sign a big-time free agent, because then that balances out, and you're not guaranteed a comp just because you lose one free agent. If you sign another that balances out in the formula, then you don't get a comp. So I'm not sure the comp pick deal is as much of a thing. Now, if you lose both Josh and Calvin, then you'd probably get 2 comp thirds next year. But you've also lost Josh and Calvin.
How does that help you in
That's
the fall?
not right.
Doesn't help you at all.
Sometimes people get, in my opinion,
right.
I'm not a big comp pick, let's count them guy, because you don't want to gain comp picks at the loss of guys you need.
All right, final big thing in our first segment here this morning, focusing on Trent Baalke and his commentary from last week in Indianapolis, and that is every single day they are working on the salary cap. The Jaguars have a decent salary cap position, even though they're right in the middle of the pack as opposed to being near the top of the heap as they've been in recent years. The general manager knows they've got something to work with.
We're right in the middle to upper tier of the league in terms of cap space available, and we've got moves that we can do to create more cap space. So we like the position we're in. We like the flexibility that we have. And again, we're not going to disclose any of our thoughts right here, but we feel good about where we're at.
Now remember, Brian, the cap, if they sign Josh and Ridley, that doesn't necessarily cripple them for this year.
Right.
That pushes out into the future. I sometimes feel sorry for GMs because they're at the podium and they're talking about the cap, and nobody looks at the cap the way GMs do. Meaning, people are looking at the cap saying, well, you got all this cap space.
They look
you got
at
all this cap space last year.
In a one-year window.
They've got a plan to make sure that you're not mortgaged and broke in 2 years. And that was the big disconnect, I think, with fans last year in the offseason. Trent, from the time that he signed that 22 class, said this is not going to be a big-time year next year because we've got to get it right and have flexibility in 24. It played out like he said it was going to play out, but nobody listened.
Right.
So whether he was right or wrong about that, there was never going to be a big spending. So he's still got to look, even with the Josh Allen and Calvin Ridley, it'll give him short-term space, but what's he going to do with that long-term? And long-term means getting room for Trevor Lawrence.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, as much as we talk about the pass rusher and the wide receiver, the looming cloud there is, how are you going to get this one done with Trevor Lawrence, and when are you going to get it done? But theoretically, as you said, a long-term deal, not the cap, not the tag, but a long-term deal for Josh Allen could really bring his number down. Same thing with Calvin Ridley.
Right, then it balloons in 3 years, though.
Absolutely. So you got to understand that it's kind of like a credit card, and you're going to have to pay the balance at some point in time, and you want to make sure that you have enough space to be able to pay that balance off with a quarterback coming up. And of course, news yesterday from Jeremy Fowler of ESPN that the Jaguars have informed defensive tackle Foley Fatukasi that they will move on from his services. That will provide a little bit of salary cap relief for them as well. In the C block of this show, coming up in about 15 minutes, we will spend a good bit of time looking at the salary cap for the Jaguars, where they're at, where they could possibly be going here as we get started on a new league year midweek next week. We'll be back. More of Jags AM to follow from the Miller Electric Center in Jacksonville right after this. Well, Magellan invites you to help them move the freight. They're voted the coolest office space in Jacksonville, and you can join their team by applying online at MagellanLogistics.com. Move the freight. All right, Brian and John back with you here on a Tuesday for Jags AM. Combine behind us, new league year in front of us. But before we get to that, let's hear from the head coach. And big thing one, from Doug's perspective, was right out of the gate, his new staff. And he went to great lengths to describe the qualities of the men that he was looking for, whether that was championship credentials or the players that they had worked with. He had a very specific idea in mind of the staff he wanted to put together on the defensive side of the ball.
A group of men that number one, are going to get the most out of our players. Obviously, scheme might change just a little bit, but I think the look of it's going to change probably the most. What you see, but it's all for the better. And again, I'm excited for the future. Excited to work with these guys. Coming up this offseason.
John, he went as far as to talk about the new defensive line coach having worked with Myles Garrett, and that being an attractive quality, especially with Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker. And he went in depth on each one of these guys and why he made the choice.
Yeah, he talked mostly about they're good teachers, or they're very good teachers. That's a huge reason he got them. They fit well with Ryan Nielsen, which is important. I think defensive backs coach
Chris Richard
is probably the name of the bunch that most NFL types sort of attach to.
From his time in Seattle.
He's got a long history of coaching defensive backs the way that Ryan Nielsen is going to want. He's important because Ryan Nielsen, not saying Ryan Nielsen can't coach every part of the defense, but his history is defensive line. So having a solid secondary coach gives you some balance there, gives you somebody that he can lean on. It's going to be more press coverage with some help over the top, with variations on that as you go forward. We'll see. I don't get too in the off season to how a defense is going to look with a first-year coordinator, because it's got to get into training camp and he's got to see how these guys are going to play within it. But that's what he historically wants to do. And all reports are good guy, good coach, can adapt to his personnel, and can teach. And that's what you want.
All right, Doug was asked about his quarterback. And you recall, at the end of the season, there were questions. There were people that had questions about Trevor Lawrence, his progression from 2022 through 2023. Where was he? Would they pay him? What did they need to see from him? All those questions. And then this, do you have the right quarterback?
Still put more of an impact to his voice in our offense, because he's the one out there executing and calling the plays. So, I want him to speak up and really take ownership in that with us. And just, the situational part of football too, just understanding game situations, managing the game in a certain way at certain times throughout the course of the game. And, these are all areas that we can continue as a staff to assist him and help him.
Johnny was definitive when asked about, do you have the right guy?
Yep.
He didn't even hesitate for a second, but then he took the time to go into that list that you just heard of things that he needed to see from his quarterback heading into his fourth NFL season.
He said multiple times, has the right guy. They believe in Trevor Lawrence, and the Combine has a couple of different purposes, many on the field, but for GMs and head coaches, it's sort of to reset the tone of the organization for people. He came out and he said, we're all in with this guy. And then he sort of did that being said,
right,
he needs to improve. He needs to improve game situations. He needs to improve turnovers. All the potential is there. So it really, I don't think it changed the narrative that much on Trevor. It reshaped how they feel about him. It reconfirmed it. I got a tone of, he's the guy, and we're going to wind up paying him because we have to, and we want to. But in the have to, want to, there's also an edge of he has to be better to fulfill that faith.
Right.
And there's no question in that, and now it's on him and the coaches to get him there.
And 3 or 4 times he used the phrase, we have to work with him.
Yep.
Right? Meaning he and his staff have to do their part to get him up. And that was a continuing theme onto the offensive line. Look, it's no surprise, and to anybody that watched this team last year, the offensive line did not have a good season. Doug, rightly so, pointed out that the left side was a constant mixing and matching of players who were healthy or who were available to him, and that created some issues, and they needed more consistency. But he says this group has to be better, and so does his coaching staff.
Put our players in position to be successful. Give them an opportunity, and that falls on us as coaches through game planning and scheming and not having too much, just have the right amount of plays to execute. And then in turn, that falls back onto the player, right? The player has to go out and play and use his God-given ability to go execute the play.
We'll see what this offensive line looks like. Obviously, it's a great draft for offensive linemen. I think there are 9 offensive tackles who will have first-round or near first-round grades. There's some centers. There's some other players of ability in the offensive group. Plus, you've got Brandon Sheriff, who's got a big cap number. We're going to talk about that coming up. Cam Robinson, that's got a big cap number. You want to get Ezra Cleveland back. So there are a lot of issues the Jaguars have to work through to get to the offensive line that they hope will be better next year.
Yeah, and it's so hard. I have people, approach me, ask me the offensive line, in the ozone ask me about the offensive line, and it's so difficult to give people answers they want because there are so many ways this could play out. I think Cam Robinson's back after what Trent Baalke said last week and after the way Doug spoke. If he's back, then you've got the 2 guys on the end you think are pretty solidified. If he's not, all of a sudden you're moving Anton Harrison probably to left. You're probably putting Walker Little over here. So that's all of a sudden 3 different possibilities. Sheriff, I sort of think he's probably gone because of the cap.
We'll talk about that.
But the cap's bigger now, and he's a veteran. Do you let him go before you know what you got to replace? I don't know. Cooper Hodges comes in there, Luke Fortner. So the way I phrased that answer, Brian, is indicative. I don't know where to go with it because there's so many possibilities. I think they're in a situation, too, where they're looking at, okay, we've got guys who have started, so we're okay. How do we get better in free agency? Okay, we got this guy, now we can get better here. In the draft, okay, so I think they may retain some guys before finding things to compete with or improve on spots because they're in a weird spot with the offensive line.
Well, it's either, at least it appears at this moment, you're either going to radically change the offensive line, right, by letting a couple of those high-dollar guys go, or you're going to stand pat, which means that you really have to coach. You really have to work to get this group that didn't play well last year to play at a much higher standard. We'll see what they do.
And the argument would be they coached last year.
Yeah.
So
let's put it this way.
I mean, just devil's advocate, if you don't make a change somewhere, you do wonder where it gets better. That is what we face.
I know receivers and corners are always a really hot topic when you get into the first round of the draft, and especially this year because there are some really good ones. But if you don't get big guys on both sides of the line, it's tough to compete week in and week out in this league. So we'll see where they put their evaluation. When we come back, we'll take a look at the salary cap from the Jaguars' top 5 hits all the way to the top 5 wide receivers in the league in terms of their salary structure. Obviously, that's changed with Mike Evans now. We'll go through it. We return to Jags AM. So there's room this year. There's more room next year, but you have to use it wisely, right? It's not monopoly money. At some point, you got to pay out real cash and figure a way how to make all those pieces fit. So let's take a look at the Jags' top 5 salary cap hits as of today. And you can see right there that you have 4 guys who are making more than $21 million. That number is going to go up because you figure that the salary cap hit for Josh Allen, Trevor Lawrence, Calvin Ridley, if you get him back, they're all going to be up in that north territory as it is.
Yeah, I don't know if the first year they'll be over 20. I think you can keep them under.
Right.
Again, some of this conversation, it depends on how they want to structure it. The Mahomes contract, which was 4 or 5 years ago, his first number was really low. I think it was below 10.
Right.
Well, it ballooned after that. It goes up to 40 or 50. So it philosophically depends on them looking at the cap and saying, well, we would rather have this hit in this year.
Right.
Have it, but at some point, those top 3 cap hits, top 4 cap hits, we're going to laugh in 2 years and think, boy, those were the days.
Yeah.
So, but looking at this, There is an X factor here that's hard to get into in a show like this. Those are the cap hits for now. Do you take some of that money for some of those guys, extend, make voidable?
Well, there's not as much.
No.
There's not as much space in there as you think. So let's go to the top 5 cap savings, right? Cap savings are when you release a player, this is what you gain. So you saw that Cam Robinson's cap figure on the last page was $21,168,301. He saves you $16 million, right? He's got a $5 million payment this year. That is what his salary is. That is savings. Darius Williams is an $11 million saving. And then 2 really difficult decisions are Sheriff and Foye Oluokun, because both of those guys are over $7 million in savings. Now, that's not, their number isn't necessarily crippling, right? But they're older guys. You got to look at it.
Yeah.
Rayshawn Jenkins will save you $5 million. We saw yesterday, just as a reference to this, that the Jaguars, according to Jeremy Fowler from ESPN, were going to move on from Foley Fatukasi.
Right.
They're going to save about $3.5 million on Foley Fatukasi. So when you look at the moves, it's a tough move to make, right? Because it's a guy that you paid. But they've got other moves they can make.
Right.
There's not a lot of restructuring room in there.
Right.
Because they did that last year.
Right. Christian, I think you could. I think there's a little bit there.
He's got $21 million in what's called dead money.
Yeah. Not that he was not going to be back.
Oh,
you
of
have
course
to bring
he's back.
Christian Kirk back. I'm just
Right.
saying.
That's not even a consideration.
That he has played his way into being enough of a core guy. You can easily see him still being here 3-4 years down the road, which is rare for a second contract guy. But he's sort of become that long-term guy. Fatukasi, first of all, I don't know is as much of a cap issue as it was in 2 years. He had not played at a high level.
And he's only saving you $3 million, so it's not
right.
really
So I don't know if
issue.
that's as much cap as it is, hey, it's just time to move on. Not every free agent works out the way you hope. The others come down to, I do think the increase in the salary cap, it doesn't help that much long term because all teams get it. So like when you're going to try to re-sign Trevor Lawrence or even Calvin, but it does help you manage what's already on your books. And I do think it helps in the sense of, because it's higher, you could maybe get a couple of guys through the start of the new league year and then make decisions on them later to help you long term rather than having to slash to get to the cap right now. See the difference there?
I do.
Yeah.
And can we go back to the most recent slide, the top 5 cap savings? What's interesting to note, and again, I was using the Spot Track service, right, which is available to anybody. It's a subscription service. So these are estimates. That's where your cap savings is. Those are the only 5 players on your roster where there are significant cap savings.
Right, now that
so the other
Fatukasi's
decision
gone,
that you can make, the other decisions that you can make is, all right, so do we redo? In other words, do we add years to Cam Robinson's deal to bring that number down? Is the general manager as committed to him as it sounded like when he spoke? And can we lessen that number, right? Change the contract up. Darius Williams, this is the last year of his deal. Do you want him enough to add years onto the deal and maybe bring that number down to $4 or $5 million this year? You're going to have to add 2 years on it to make that number work. Same thing with Sheriff and Oluokun, guys who are getting up there a bit in age. Do you really want to extend to get the savings?
I'd be surprised if there's any extensions like that outside of Cam. I cannot see Darius Williams being extended in the way you're talking about.
Even though he's coming off a year where he was at the top of the AFC.
Yeah, I don't
passes
think
defensed
at age with that corner, like he's not old, but in football terms, I don't know that you commit to him long term. Sheriff, I don't really think you would extend the commitment there because it does seem like injuries are starting to slow that.
Yeah.
I could be dead wrong on that because he's a good player that they love in the locker room, so he may have a different element to it. Rayshawn, I love. I don't think he's here next year because I think ideally you want to have, when you signed these guys in 21 and 22, you want to have drafted well enough to replace some of these guys.
Right.
I think they did with Antonio Johnson.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes the ideal hey, sign you for 3, which Rayshon put in 3 years here.
Yep.
For second contract free agents, that's about what you want.
Well, and he gave you 2 of the biggest defensive plays in franchise history.
It's a successful signing, but in this business, second contract free agents, I don't know the number, but they often do not play out the entire contract by design.
And by the way, the Jaguars have gotten a little bit more from their free agents. Roy Robertson Harris was part of that class as well.
They've done very well signing free agents. My point with this topic is a lot of times when you cut guys at this point, people say, oh, you mismanaged the cap. You're having to cut guys.
No.
If Rayshon is released, for example, that's not really mismanaging the cap.
Right.
They knew when they signed him, probably a 2 or 3 year contract, the fact that he played 3 and gave you 2 big plays, that makes it successful, even though you have to eat some dead money at the end. That process is how the league works right now. It's not, that's sort of the standard operating procedure. It's not mismanaging. The mismanaging took place 25 years ago.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. We live with it. Numbers can get they can all start to run together. But the bottom line is the Jaguars have some decisions that they can make. They're not all easy decisions, right? Cam Robinson, Foye Oluokun, these are not easy moves by any stretch of the imagination. But if the Jaguars put a plan together, they can carve out enough cap room to do what they want to do. And that is what Trent Baalke has been saying all along. 2 more things we want to talk about real quick. First of all, Josh Allen's deal. We'll find out today. Today is the deadline for the Jaguars to give him the franchise tag. And if not, they've got to get a deal done with him before the start of the new league year when he would become a free agent. Here are the top 5 edge rushers in terms of salary as of today. And you see right there, I mean, look, Nick Bosa, clear and away, is the highest paid guy. But you're looking to get an average in there somewhere around 26, 27 million if you're Josh Allen. If you just want to be in the top 5. If you want to be the top paid guy, you got to get to 35.
Yeah, and boy, I just think that if both sides want to get it done, they'll get it done. And I do think the projected cap going up helps this situation. And then as soon as I say that, it doesn't because both sides sort of know it and they want to push those numbers up. Jaguars want to keep it down. I've got to think Josh gets done, and maybe that's just sort of because I want to see it get done.
And somewhere there in that Joey Bosa range, perhaps about 27 million. I mean, it's tough to make the case that you deserve what Nick Bosa and TJ want.
Well,
yeah, because both of those guys are league leaders.
And that's what Trent Baalke. That's what I say if I'm Trent Baalke.
Right.
If I'm Josh Allen's people, I say, well, maybe, but we all know that this top number at every position goes up every year. In 3 years with the cap going up, if you pay Josh 30, in 3 years, that's going to be a bargain. That's going to be their side of it.
Sure.
And that's why these things aren't easy, because everybody's always trying to adjust for not only inflation, which, that's one, but salary inflation and cap inflation. So you're almost guessing. It's a little bit akin to the Christian Kirk conversation 3 years ago. Remember when Christian Kirk was, oh my goodness, how could you pay Christian? But now he's a bargain.
Yeah.
So from Josh's team's point of view, they're looking at that and saying, well, that's how this thing works. From the team's point of view, they're saying, well, you're really good, but you're not quite Nick Bosa.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, everybody gets that.
Yeah.
So that's where the conflict is.
All right, and a quick look at the top 5 numbers for wide receivers, which has obviously changed in the last 36 hours because now you've got Mike Evans from Tampa, who would slot in there between A.J. Brown and Cooper Kupp at about $26 million a year. But if you're going to pay Calvin Ridley, and if there's a market out there for him, he's going to be looking to jump somewhere into this range, you would imagine.
Yeah, and again, for the same reason. I anybody who's read me or listened to me, I think Calvin Ridley should be back on the team next year. Whatever he, quote, wasn't, he gave you elements that are important. Again, I would have a tough time if these numbers didn't sort of rise fast. I don't know that I could put Calvin in that bunch because he's probably just a touch below that. But if this is going to keep escalating, which it is,
right, then
that's where the argument becomes, well, look, you're paying him for what you think he's going to be and what the market's going to be. Again, that's what makes if we weren't sitting here sort of crunching on this conversation, these deals would already be done.
Right.
This is the conflict that makes these deals tough to get.
Well, and even if he comes in underneath, DK Metcalf, which was $24,500,000, you're bumping up against that to get something with Calvin.
Yeah. Well, I think you're in the Christian range. Christian was 23.
No, Christian's range is 24, 236, 932.
So that's
to be exact.
That's probably the ballpark. I'm gonna play in that ballpark, Brian.
Yeah.
That's a nice ballpark.
I'd play in a fraction of it.
Yeah.
That's all it takes. All right, so the cap conversation, there you go. Food for thought as you move forward towards the start of the legal tampering period. We'll talk about that when we come back on Jags AM. All right, back to wrap up Jags AM on a Tuesday. Legal tampering period. That's what it's called. It opens on Monday. That is a negotiation window. And the last couple of years, it's been useful to see what teams were doing almost right out of the gate.
Well, it's free agency.
Yeah.
It's legal tampering, but it has become a thing where by 3 or 4 hours into that,
you get deals popping.
The free agency landscape is, I don't want to put a percentage on it, but it's there. Like, you can see how it's playing out. A lot of the big names are gone. So the reality is, doesn't always work like this, but usually if long-term deals with teams aren't done by the time tampering starts, it's usually over.
Right.
Now, that's not in always. There are unusual situations. Maybe they tell Calvin, we really want you. We've got to get you through the start of the new league year because of that, the clause in the second or third round pick. But historically, anytime you hear a GM say, well, we're going to let him test the market, well, you shake the guy's hand and say, well, thank you very much.
Good luck to you.
I really enjoyed your time here. So we'll see.
It's going to be a busy couple of days.
And I say all that with the caveat of every free agency period sort of takes its own life. So you never know. If it's always possible that what I just said doesn't come to fruition.
Right.
That's just the history of it. And we may be talking about a different trend next year because trends in this league can change fast.
All right. That'll do it for Jags AM on Tuesday. We'll be back next week. I believe Kai will be back with us. And we'll be right in the middle between the start of the legal tampering period and the start of the new league year. So we'll have plenty to talk about next Tuesday here on Jags AM. Have a great week.